good evening. Well, the Australian National University leadership is investigating allegations that pro-Palestinian students performed the Nazi salute and gestures impersonating Hitler last night. The activists have been caught on camera making what appears to be Hitler impersonations in a meeting where Jewish students were fighting for their safety on campus. And we're going to show you those images in a moment. This comes as police were today called to universities in Queensland and Melbourne as pro-Palestinian activities grew violent and abusive. The anti-Semitism and hatred is infecting most major universities in Australia, with students also caught on film saying that Zionists aren't welcome on campus. Well, we can tonight show you exclusive videos from the student AGM at the ANU last night. In the Zoom meeting, Jewish students put forward a motion that said Jewish students have a right to belong to the ANU community. And it called for the student union to condemn Hamas, to condemn the comments made by a student, Beatrice Tucker, on ABC last week that supported Hamas, and also the hateful slogans and anti-Semitic hate speech. The motion also proposed that the student union should support a two-state solution to end the conflict in the Middle East. Yet all of these points were struck down. Just let that sink in. Now, apparently, the pro-Palestinian students only want one state, from the river to the sea. They want the eradication of Israel. Multiple students claim that during the meeting, they saw an activist doing what appeared to be the Nazi salute. You can see it on your screen now. We've had to blur the vision heavily for legal reasons. Then in other images, a student appears to impersonate the Hitler moustache. You can see that now. And this all at a meeting where Jewish students were trying to move a motion that they are entitled to feel safe on campus. Now, the ANU Observer reported today that those who allegedly performed these gestures were immediately removed from the Zoom meeting by the ANU Student Association. It is a criminal offence in Australia to perform the Nazi salute in a public place. And the ANU Observer reported that multiple students have told the Observer they have or are in the process of reporting the alleged gestures to the Australian Federal Police. But when we spoke to the AFP, they said they hadn't received any reports as yet regarding this alleged racist behaviour. Now, if these pro-Palestinian activists were impersonating Hitler or Nazi gestures, this is truly shocking. It exposes the farce of this student pro-Palestinian movement for not caring at all about Gaza, but being driven by their hatred for Jews. If the students cared about Palestinians, they'd be happy to condemn the terrorist organisation Hamas. But they don't care about Palestinians. They just want a Hamas victory, as Beatrice Tucker made clear on the ABC last week.
But surely, if you're going to protest against that, you've also got to send a message to Hamas to release the hostages, don't you?
Well, I actually say that Hamas deserve our unconditional support, not because I agree with their strategy.
You can't condemn what Hamas did in October last year?
I will not condemn what Hamas did. We must be unconditional, but we must be critical also,
Luke?
right?
That's obviously an edited excerpt of a longer interview, but you get the point. Now, we put questions about this to the ANU Chancellor, former Liberal Foreign Minister Julie Bishop, today. Now, she didn't answer our questions, but her media team came back to us and they told us they were aware of this incident last night. They said ANU will investigate the incident in accordance with the university's existing processes and take appropriate action as required. They said, to be clear, any racism or hate speech, including anti-Semitism, is unacceptable at ANU. That university acts swiftly if such behaviour occurs. Well, let's see how swiftly they act, if at all, because they said, to be clear, hate speech is unacceptable, but we haven't seen any action so far to stop harassment and abuse on campus. Now, Julie Bishop wanted to be the Prime Minister, remember? She put her hand up in the leadership spill. Didn't get many votes. But she can't even clean up the anti-Semitism on a Canberra University campus. It's very disappointing. One student from ANU who I spoke to today was deeply distressed, emotional and anxious after the past week. Now, university should be a fun and carefree time in a young person's life. It shouldn't be a period of abuse and discrimination. Monash University and the University of Queensland also called in the police today as the protest movement grew out of hand.
And that's what we're doing right now. This man needs to leave immediately. And you people, every time you dare to show your face, you Israeli-loving genocide supporters, we will be here, we will not leave.
And last week, you may recall that I reported here on the show leaked documents from the University of Sydney where they said that the chants of Intifada were not hate speech, that they were fine on campus. Well, we were very critical on this program of Mark Scott and Belinda Hutchinson. There was also widespread outrage after we reported on this. Well, today we learn, thanks to the Herald, that Mark Scott has now written to Attorney General Mark Dreyfus to see whether these chants are against the law. And this will be a crucial determination, because if the chants are hate speech, then protesters across the country will have to stop these illegal chants. And Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has already weighed into this issue. He told Josh Frydenberg when he was put on the spot that the chants of "From the River to the Sea" have no place in our country, on our streets.
On the issue of the river to the sea, Dennis Richardson again described it as an extremely violent statement. And so it has no place on our streets.
I agree.
Tomorrow, the United Nations General Assembly will vote on whether to admit Palestine as a full member state of the United Nations. Now, I've confirmed that the Albanese government, as of this afternoon, was still currently examining the draft. They hadn't made a final decision about whether they're supporting this or not. And I'm told that Albanese is said to have not made up his own mind yet. There has already been a cabinet discussion on it. No conclusion ultimately reached, I'm told. Now, at best, Labor will abstain. At best. But if Albanese and Penny Wong support the recognition of Palestine as a UN member state, as they're inclined to do, they will be rewarding terrorism. Julian Leeser said it well here last night. He said this vote would not be happening if it weren't for the Hamas attacks on October 7, the Hamas slaughter of babies and children, the rape and execution of young women. Now, the lesson from that bloodbath can't be that Hamas, as the current governing body of Gaza, is rewarded with statehood. And as Jeremy Liebler wrote in the Fin Review today, this vote would send a dangerous message that recognition requires no reform, no effort, no negotiation, and no commitment to live in peace alongside Israel. Before there is any Palestinian state, its leadership need to recognise that Israel has a right to exist, free from rape, terror and slaughter. Now tonight, an ANU student who was at that meeting last night and was fighting for her safety on campus would join me on the show tonight. She's very brave for speaking out. Also, pandemic premiers lashed for their COVID overreach with new revelations of how states, especially Victoria, imposed rules on us without seeking medical advice. And still no move from the Prime Minister to defend our military and stand up to China. Today, I'm going to have the Shadow Defence Minister, Andrew Hastie, on the program to speak about it. But first, let's bring in right now National Senator Matt Canavan. Matt, great to see you. Look, the coalition is now calling for a Senate inquiry into anti-Semitism. I've just been on university campuses. I've just been speaking about this issue at the start of my show. You know, this isn't about shutting down free speech. perfectly fine for Australians not to agree with each other, to have a different view on the war. But what's not fine is students to be intimidated and harassed and abused because of their religion, to feel unsafe turning up to campus. And that's what's unfolding in multiple universities that cost tens of thousands of dollars to attend.
You're absolutely right, Sharri, and you've described that distinction very well there, that we're a free country and people are free to have their views on different actions that other people take all around the world. And obviously young students are often going to take strident positions, sometimes I think misguided positions, like I did in my misspent youth at university. But it's free. They're free to do so. They're free to make even mistakes in terms of their views at least. They're not free to harass other people. They're certainly not free to discriminate against other people based on their religion. And these things must be stamped out. And there must be very strong leadership from our government and university leaders that any examples of that kind will be responded to with severe penalties. Likewise, too, you are not free as a student to interrupt the studies of other students by camping out in common areas or overtaking buildings, defacing buildings. I don't understand why these students are not immediately expelled. I mean, where's the discipline? These are ultimately educational institutions, and there should be there is a set of standards and a code of conduct that students are expected to abide by. And if they do interfere with other students, certainly if they harass or discriminate against other students based on their religion, then they should be dismissed from the school. End of story.
Well, let's bring in now Senior Fellow at the Menzies Research Institute, Nick Cater. I mean, Nick, part of the problem is the weakness of the university chancellors and vice-chancellors, people like Julie Bishop at ANU.
Exactly right, Sharri. I mean, you get the impression they've been cowered into silence on this. They just don't seem to be able to stand up with the required vigour and firmness that's needed. I also think that it comes from the Prime Minister and the government, which, as you know, has had an equivocating response to this whole thing from the very start. I just don't see that firmness from the current Prime Minister that you would have seen from, say, John Howard or Tony Abbott. So, look, the students are not getting the kind of pushback that they need, certainly at the university level. I mean, I think it's quite appalling, really, that the chancellors and vice-chancellors should just be prepared to let this happen and basically take a softly approach, because that won't help. It's just going to get worse, as we've seen on the American campuses. We need firm action, firm condemnation right now.
And I should mention, Nick, because everyone will be confused. It's obviously nighttime in most parts of Australia, except potentially not WA. But you're coming to us now from the other side of the world.
I'm in Helsinki, yes. I'm over here to investigate the nuclear power industry, which is going very well here in Helsinki, and that's what I'm here for.
Well, that sounds like a great trip. And Matt Canavan, maybe some of the Labor MPs who are so set against nuclear, who won't have an open mind about it, should go and investigate as well.
Yeah, and maybe the Greens political party should too, because my understanding of the Greens over there actually support and are very strong advocates for nuclear power. And the closed-minded approach we have and see from the Labor and Greens party here seems to be totally because they are obsessed with renewable energy, in hock almost, to a renewable energy industry that's addicted to spending your money, taxpayers' money. It's the only way they survive. And now, because of that unholy alliance funded by your taxes, there's just no even consideration of other forms of energy. And we see the results. We see the results in New South Wales today. The average electricity price in the wholesale market was $3,500 per megawatt hour, well over 100 times it normally is. And this is happening on an increasing basis because we just do not have enough reliable power, as we've invested in a lot of intermittent, unreliable, renewable power.
Indeed. Now, Greg Hunt has come out today and he's lashed states and territories for making what he calls unilateral health decisions during the COVID-19 pandemic. Here was Greg Hunt on my colleague Chris Kenny's show a bit earlier.
I highlighted in the submission that I was not aware of medical advice for curfews in Victoria or for the 5 kilometre rule. And I believe there was some discussion at the time that there was not a medical basis. And
it was not.
If you had to have medical advice, then those elements would arguably never have occurred. And I think that would have been a good outcome.
Nick Hayter, look, we had heard before suggestions that Victorian Premier Dan Andrews was at times relying on public polling rather than medical advice when he made some of his more contentious decisions. But to hear Greg Hunt, who was the Federal Health Minister, come out and say he didn't know of any medical advice specifically that Victoria was relying on, well, there'll be a lot of people who feel very angry about that, particularly parents whose children were suffering mental health issues.
Well, let's put the usual caveats in place, Sharri. This was a novel virus. Nobody knew how to deal with it. Nobody knew how bad it was. So I'm going to cut state and federal governments and leaders a little bit of slack there. But I think the mistake the federal government did was to sit back and let the states make these decisions about closing borders, about lockdowns. We didn't see any pushback that I could see publicly, or no serious pushback from the federal government against these ridiculous lockdowns in Melbourne, nor about the excessive policing that went on. You know, I mean, somebody should have stood up and said, we just don't behave to Australian citizens in that way. That is just not the way this country runs. I didn't hear any of that at the time, except, you know, some good people on your program and elsewhere on Sky, but certainly not from our political leaders. A very, very troubling period in Australia's history, in my view.
It's so funny how quickly we forget and we just move on from it when, you know, it's absurd to think that park benches literally had, you know, crime police take across them. I remember my son was literally one at the time, and I had to sneak him onto a beach so he could feel his toes in the sand and in the seawater, and the whole time I was petrified about getting a fine. Matt Canavan, I mean, those are such minor examples compared to families who couldn't get across the states to get medical treatment. But how did we get into this?
You're a criminal, Sharri. You were putting grandmas at risk. How dare you?
But how did we get into this? How did we accept all of this? Yeah.
Yeah, and I want to pick up on something Nick said. It is very perceptive. And I welcome Greg's comments today, his candour. It's welcome now, but I know Greg has said that in the future public health advice should be published, or there should be a rule that it's made public. Well, it raises the question why this federal government public health advice against the 5 kilometre rule, for example, wasn't published at the time. I mean, Greg Hunt was the minister at the time. Why didn't he direct this public health advice to be made public, and so we could all see that Dan Andrews' rules were draconian and not based on any science at all. And Nick's right that there's very few politicians who came in against it. I would also cut politicians some slack in 2020, that it was novel then. But a year or so later in 2021, we kind of knew about the virus very well, and we continued with this approach. I became very critical of it, and anyone who did was pilloried because, you know, as I was saying, you're a grandma killer, you were going against scientific advice, and we were all operating in the dark, apparently, because Greg Hunt didn't publish this advice at the time.
Yeah, I think we do need a proper full Royal Commission, if only to know how to not even for the blame game, just to know, although that would be nice as well, a bit of the blame game, but to know how we handle it the next time there is a virus that comes out of a laboratory somewhere, because undoubtedly at some point in the next 20 years, 50 years, next century, that is going to happen. We're going to face the same questions again, and we won't know how to handle it. Now, very quickly before we go, I want to play you this quite amazing comment from United States Senator Lindsey Graham today. Have a look.
Israel's been hit in the last few weeks by Iran, Hezbollah, and Hamas, dedicated to their destruction. And you're telling me you're going to tell them how to fight the war and what they can and can't use when everybody around them wants to kill all the Jews? And you're telling me that if we withhold weapons in this fight, the existential fight for the life of the Jewish state, it won't send the wrong signal? Do you still think it was a good idea, General Austin, to get out of Afghanistan?
Nick Hayter, what do you think of this move by Joe Biden to effectively withhold weapons from Israel when it's fighting a war, as Lindsey Graham says, on 3 fronts?
I think this is shocking. I think it's troubling, Sharri. Israel is involved in a war that is not of its making. It is defending its territory. It's defending its people against the kind of attack we saw back in October. We know Hamas has said they will do it again. That was just a prelude. They have to get rid of Hamas, and that means going in with full force right now and getting the job done. I think for America to back off at this stage is deeply, deeply troubling. You expect the leader of the free world, as we once called the President of the United States, to take a firm stand when it comes to civilization versus barbarism. And that's what we're seeing in Israel, Gaza. And it's why we have to give Israel all the help it needs to finish the job.
Yeah, and if anyone hasn't read this yet, I highly recommend reading the Wall Street Journal's editorial on this. It's currently on the Australian's website. It is simply brilliant. Matt, just very quickly before we go, it's Mother's Day this weekend. Happy Mother's Day to all the mums out there. We're starting to see schools, including the Hunter Valley Grammar School, encouraging students to celebrate everyone, not just mothers. What do you think of this woke ideology?
Well, of course, I'm not a mum, Sharri, but
that's
I
lucky, and you do have to declare that because not everyone knows these days.
I've been playing mum this week. My wife's away in Tasmania visiting her sister, and man, it's so hard. It is so hard juggling these kids. They're great kids, but it's much harder than my job as a senator. And so I just always so grateful to my wife what she does. But there's something very uniquely human about being a mum. Like I'm not one, and I don't know, but rearing a child, bringing him to life over 9 months inside you, there's something really special about that we should have a word for. We should have maybe a day. I mean, we now have a month for gay pride, but mums just get one day, and let's keep it for them.
I think a month would be a good idea. Matt Canavan, Nick Cater, thank you both so much for your time. Now, coming up, Nazi salutes and Hitler impersonations. We're going to speak to a student who was at that meeting at ANU last night. Also, Beijing accuses us of being spies despite targeting our Navy personnel, our pilots. Shadow Defence Minister Andrew Hastie will join me to discuss. Welcome back. Well, let's now turn to the escalating tensions between Canberra and Beijing over the dangerous helicopter near clash in the Yellow Sea. The Chinese Defence Ministry is now pushing the narrative that our Seahawk helicopter was spying on their Navy exercises. And they say this is why their fighter jets dropped the flares. Now, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has said that the Australian chopper was just conducting legitimate, peaceful activity. Have a look.
This action by China was unprofessional and unacceptable. We've made that very, very clear.
Joining me now, Shadow Defence Minister Andrew Hastie. Andrew, great to see you again. Look, Anthony Albanese says he's made his disapproval very, very clear. And yet we still don't have any information, and it appears that none of his ministers have actually spoken to their Chinese counterparts.
That's right, Sharri. We're yet to hear from the Prime Minister that the Defence Minister, Richard Marles, has raised this, or Penny Wong, the Foreign Minister, has raised this. He hasn't raised it himself, and I think this is at the point where it has to be raised at the ministerial level, if not by the Prime Minister himself. He should pick up the phone and put the call through to President Xi. Even if the phone is not picked up, he's done that on behalf of our uniformed personnel, and that's a really important signal he sends them. It sends a signal that he's got their back in moments like this, because I agree wholeheartedly with what the CDF said today. The actions of the Chinese were illegal, coercive, aggressive and deceptive. Deceptive because the Chinese government is giving us a masterclass at the moment in gaslighting, flipping the tables and accusing us of spying.
Andrew, I think this is something that not a lot of people have covered. You were in the SAS. You know what it's like to fight for your country. What do you think that Australia's armed personnel would be feeling now when they go out and put their lives on the line, and they don't do so knowing that if there's an incident, because there's now been two, there was that incident last year with the sonar attack, that if there's an incident, the Prime Minister is incapable of calling the President she and defending them?
Well, I think in Australia, as with other democracies, we have civilian control of the military. So our ministers, our Prime Minister and our Defence Minister, are the leaders of the ADF. And so when that happens to our personnel, with the divers, as you mentioned, and with our air crew, with the Seahawk, I reckon they'd expect our leaders to stand up for them, particularly with this sort of coercive bullying behaviour that we're seeing from the Chinese military. The fact that hasn't happened, I think, sends a bad signal to our ADF. And I can tell you now, Peter Dutton, if he was our Prime Minister, he'd be picking up the phone, because he's not a guy you push around. And I think that's the key message here. We're seeing weakness from this government, particularly the Prime Minister and the Defence Minister.
Now, you're Shadow Defence Minister, so I just want to ask you about this story that I spoke about a moment ago. The Wall Street Journal has said that Joe Biden denying its arms, denying bombs to Israel, is basically an invitation to Israel's enemies like Iran to take advantage, not only in hostage talks, but also on the battlefield. What do you think about this?
Look, I think the single objective is the defeat and the destruction of Hamas. This war has to end, and it only ends when Hamas is destroyed both as a military and a political force. And if that's the objective, then Israel and its allies must be doing everything they can to reach that objective so this war can end and we can enter into negotiations for a peaceful settlement. And my fear is that this move by the US government slows that process down. It slows the march towards the defeat of Hamas. And that's why, on the face of it, this is a very problematic decision.
It also, could leave Israel in a very vulnerable position if Iran, if Hezbollah, if Hamas decides to seize on this moment to attack Israel. And, what if it doesn't have enough arms to defend its people? I mean, Israel has come under attack, and it feels like Joe Biden keeps forgetting that. Meanwhile, the Albanese government... sorry, go ahead.
No, you finish, Sharri.
The Albanese government is now deciding which way to vote on tomorrow's United Nations resolution on whether to admit Palestine as a full member state of the UN. Again, they haven't made up their mind. The best outcome would be Australia abstaining from this vote, but they could support it. They absolutely could. I know that for a fact. I've spoken to people this afternoon. As of this afternoon, they still were deciding. The Prime Minister hadn't yet made up his mind. They had concerns about a couple of clauses in the draft. That was it. So we could very well see them support it. But, again, this would be rewarding Hamas for the terror attack, for the slaughter of entire families, for the rape and execution of young women. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree, Sharri. It's as simple as that. This is a time for strength, not weakness. And in the face of evil, you've actually got to stand up for good and push back. And Israel at the moment is under attack from Hamas, Hezbollah, Iran. And if we show weakness here, if the free world shows weakness here, it only emboldens them and incentivises them to do more of this evil terrorism. So it's pretty clear, and I think every vote that we cast in the UN, every decision we make must be about defeating Hamas and terrorism and upholding other democratic allies like Israel.
I mean, if you do get into government at the next election, if the coalition does win, I mean, it's a big ask, but if that happens, how difficult do you think it would be to undo so much of this foreign policy, whether it's on China or on Israel, that has changed under Penny Wong?
I'm a big believer in the power of leadership, and all you need is good leadership at the head of this country. Right now, we don't have good leadership. Under Peter Dutton, I'm sure we will, and I'll be doing everything I can as a member of his cabinet if we win government to right the course and to make decisions that are in the interests of our country, the free world and our allies.
And at the moment, they seem to be forgetting who our allies and who our enemies are. It's unbelievable. Andrew Hastie, thank you very much.
I think they're captive. Yes, Sharri, thank you.
No, go ahead. Do you think they're captive?
I was just going to say, I think this Labor government is captive to domestic political concerns, and they're sacrificing Australian interests on that altar, and that's not good for this country at all. And we'll fix that.
Indeed, Andrew Hastie, thank you so much for joining me. Now, as we discussed earlier, the Australian National University is now investigating an incident that allegedly occurred at one of the student AGM meetings last night. In the meeting, one student appears to be seen performing the Nazi salute. You can see it there now. And in another, a student appears to impersonate a Hitler moustache. Now, this is highly concerning. As I spoke about at the start of the show, we've put questions to ANU about this today. They say they're investigating it and will take swift action if it's proved. Now, the ANU student and Australasian Union of Jewish Students ACT co-president, Maya Grinberg, was at that meeting. She was part of it and she joins me now. Maya, thank you so much for your time and for your courage in coming on the show and speaking out, because it has not been a safe place at ANU for Jewish students. Can you tell us some about what you've been facing on campus?
Hi, Sharri. Thank you for having me. So on campus, over the past 6 months, the situation at ANU and across universities in Australia has just been getting progressively worse and worse. Last Monday, Students for Justice Palestine in Canberra started an encampment at the Australian National University, right in the centre of the university. So on Canberra lawns, where on one side you have a massive building where they have classes every single day. There are lots of teaching rooms in there. On the other side, you have a student accommodation, and all around you have cafes. On the lawns right there, they've started an encampment where every single day they protest and they call for the support of Hamas and the end to Israel.
I mean, it's just such a hard environment to be in. But, you know, last night I understand that it escalated. What happened on that student Zoom meeting? And I understand that you were actually putting forward motions about the rise in anti-Semitism and about protecting Jewish students on campus.
Yes. So last night we had the ANU Students Association's AGM. And in that AGM, our secretary, Jazz, put forward a motion which was about Jewish students feeling the right to belong at university. And the motion included condemning Hamas, it included the progressive notions of a two-state solution, and it included practical ways to make Jewish students feel welcome and safe on campus. And unfortunately, this motion was completely torn apart, and it was left in a state which Jewish students could no longer support the motion.
It's unbelievable. I mean, I read today what happened. I read the minutes of the meeting and how all those points were struck out. They want a one-state solution, it seems. It's completely bizarre. But then what happened with these students allegedly, what appears to be doing the Nazi salute, and one of the other students, as we saw there, they appeared to have their finger as a moustache in a reference to Hitler. Can you tell us about how that unfolded?
It's actually quite shocking to have witnessed that last night. So as we were presenting our motion, and there was an amendment to the motion which essentially stripped down the motion to just include the phrases Jewish students should feel safe on campus. It took away the part that condemns Hamas, including in that. And as this debate was going on, there were individuals who were on the Zoom call who were making these motions which seem very clear to myself. However, of course, they have to be investigated. And the Jewish students were watching this and were absolutely shocked and terrified that this could be going on within their own university. And it really speaks to me about how, as a society, we really have to look into Holocaust education and understand how these university students who are seeking tertiary degrees, how they can be so ignorant as to threaten us in this way.
So well said. And, it shows that this isn't about the Palestinian cause. This is about Jewish people and not wanting Jewish people to even be on campus or exist. Now, I understand you've written a letter to the Vice-Chancellor. What did you write about, and have you received any support?
Yes, so throughout the past 6 months, we started writing letters during October, after October 7th, occurred, the tragedy of it all really impacted on students. And we have since, as August members as well, they've written letters to the Vice-Chancellor, and these letters have always been delegated down, and some staff member in the university has been assigned to talk to us. And whilst they've been useful, we would really appreciate the opportunity to talk to the Vice-Chancellor. Unfortunately, we haven't been given that opportunity, and we haven't heard directly from the Vice-Chancellor. But we're getting to the point now where real action has to be taken by the senior leadership at the university, because students don't feel safe. They don't feel that they can go to class without the risk of being harassed or being targeted for their culture and their identity.
Maya, how old are you?
I'm 20 years old.
I feel so sad that you, as a 20-year-old, are on the front line of this anti-Semitism crisis that we're all facing in Australia, but that you and your friends and you know, your colleagues, the young Australians right around the country, have to deal with this day in, day out. It's not good enough. The chancellors, the vice-chancellors, our political leaders need to be stronger. I'm sure everyone watching this tonight would be thinking how incredibly articulate you are. Thank you for coming on the show. Amazing bravery and courage, and I really hope you don't have to deal with harassment as a result of speaking publicly and coming on Sky News. Maya Grinberg, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now, coming up, domestic violence still on a bumpy road to change, with New South Wales Parliament now set to introduce some new legislation, and the government readying for another critical High Court decision that could see even more detainees released. Stay tuned. We'll talk about this with tonight's political panel after the break. Welcome back. Well, reports today that a man has been charged, accused of stabbing a woman in the neck, head and back at a Sydney gym in what is allegedly another horrendous case of domestic violence. Let's bring in tonight's panel, Sky News contributor Jason Morrison and the Australian's National Affairs editor Joe Kelly. Welcome to you both. Now, Jason, just this afternoon, this man has been charged, so we have to be careful about what we can say here. But we know that there are a number of proposed changes to New South Wales Parliament that the Premier is looking at. The clear problem that we've been speaking about is that so many of these cases happen when the offenders are out on bail, and that's where urgent change is needed.
That's the problem. The judicial system is conditioned to consider bail almost on just about everything. I mean, you'd be amazed what people get bail for, and until you spend a day in court, you just don't realise how much it is handed out and around. And the argument always that comes back is, oh, we wouldn't have jails big enough to house these people. Well, there's part of your problem. Build more jails. If we have the problem, build more facilities to do it. But there's another thing. We kid ourselves. Now, again, we're speaking generally here, but anyone who does a Google search can join the dots. We talk about these things like intensive corrections orders. Now, intensive correction order sounds like hot stuff. It's crap. It's home detention. Home detention is dished out to people. You can't give someone who is a serial repeat offender for a particular crime, particularly this one, an intensive correction order, a home detention. It doesn't work. It doesn't send the message. So bail's our problem, and stupid judicial decisions. And we can spend as much time as possible looking for ways to socially change and to tilt the way men think and all this kind of stuff, or we can actually punish the perpetrators.
Exactly.
And that's where we fail.
Exactly. Joe Kelly, so often in the national debate, you know, all men are to blame, when in fact, you know, the justice system knows well who the repeat offenders are. And it's those people who, you know, you think shouldn't be given the presumption of bail. They shouldn't be given the presumption of innocence. If you've violently beat a woman so many times, why would you be let out on bail only to reoffend? And this is what we're seeing is happening in many of the cases, and yet we haven't heard the Prime Minister speak about that. We hear him speaking about fixing online misogyny. We hear him speaking about social media companies. What do you think?
Oh, Sharri, I think there's no doubt that public safety and law and order has become a huge political issue, and what people want to see is leadership, and that means action. It doesn't necessarily mean talking and using this as a political issue to make all the right gestures. People want to see outcomes, and we've seen this recently. We ran a poll the other day by SEC Newgate was a Mood of the Nation survey, which showed that in the last 2 months, the number of people saying that law and order and public safety was important had doubled. It had doubled in 2 months, 61% of people nominating it as one of the key issues. So I agree with Jason. We need concrete steps, concrete action. The leadership needs to happen not just at the political level, but leadership within the legal system as well. So it's a two-pronged issue with leadership needed from both our politicians and the judicial system as well, Sharri.
And Sharri, you know, I look at this, actually it's not a popular thing to say. On this front, I actually think it's got nothing to do with Albanese. I mean, the problem is at state level here.
No, of course, but he is speaking about this issue. He's trying to own it politically.
He's trying to own it.
An election promise was that he was going to end generational domestic violence. He called the National Cabinet of all the premiers last week. Of course, bail is a state-by-state issue, but he could have said, well, let's put this on the table, go back and implement tough laws,
so Joe is
which,
right.
as Paul Murray said, which is similar to what John Howard did with gun laws. Yes.
I'll just point out that I think, and this was a point I made last week, that the commitment from Anthony Albanese, the position of the federal Labor government, is to end violence against women and children within a generation. That's the commitment.
Exactly.
Now, that, I think, is a very difficult thing to do, but that's the goal he set, so he needs to be judged by it, and he's going to need to do more than what we saw out of that special emergency National Cabinet meeting if that goal is to be achieved.
You won't change a thing until you change judicial attitudes, until we change the way the legal fraternity and their brothers on the bench actually come to terms with the
but you can set, the Premier can set minimum sentences for certain crimes.
They can, and they won't. They won't do it. It's against the DNA of Labor. It's unfortunately against the DNA of people in the Liberal Party. They will not do minimum sentences. They're cowardly on this front, and it's all over the political spectrum. And yet, you know, Joe, your poll.
Violence crisis like this, there should be minimum sentences for repeat offenders.
But they won't do it. They will. Neither side will do it. They've done it once in Australian history, I believe, in the Northern Territory, and the political class in Canberra caved on it and thought it was a disastrous thing to do and unpicked it. We talk about these things. We're let down consistently by the good old boys, the legal fraternity, in the judiciary, and this time in the major political parties.
All right, tomorrow the High Court will deliver its judgment in the case of an Iranian man who's refused to cooperate with his deportation. He claims it would be unsafe for him to return home. Now, this ruling could pave the way for the release of another 170 immigration detainees into the community. Joe, this could yet again be another scandal for the Albanese government.
Well, Sharri, you'd hope that the government at this time has prepared some contingency plans in the event that they lose this case in the High Court. Now, obviously, most people, nearly everyone, I hope, would be expecting or hoping the government to win this case. But this was the problem last year when we had that landmark decision by the High Court in NZYQ. Now, that was a complete game changer. That just shot a hole through the entire immigration detention framework. I think that would have been difficult for any government to respond to. But I think Labor has made nearly every wrong step it could have since then. And the stunning thing is the complete lack of accountability. The establishment of this community protection safety board, which is clearly meant as a shield to protect the government from various decisions relating to these detainees, and we're seeing more and more of them fall through the cracks. The great danger, of course, is that we get about 200 more of these dangerous non-citizens released into the community, and that will just be double the trouble for the government.
Yeah, and put community safety at risk. But, you know, Joe mentions that community safety board, community protection board. Well, in fact, they don't make the decision, Jason. They give the recommendation to the government, and the government makes the decision. And you've got Andrew Giles, the immigration minister, who used to be a refugee advocate lawyer.
Oh, yeah. He's in the club. This is the classic case of people doing this. It's not my fault. It's his fault. It's their fault. Their fault. And Prime Minister, and indeed the former activist immigration minister, he's the same thing. They are never responsible for these things, yet they are. The old phrase, the buck stops. The buck has stopped. It is sitting on their shoulders, and they just keep pointing at everyone else. Don't blame us. It was the courts. Don't blame us. It was the DPP. Don't blame us. It was the board. It's never their fault. then where's this stop? And that's the problem. And I have trouble with the language because we keep calling these people immigration detainees. They're not. They're garbage. They're criminals. They're drug dealers, traffickers, rapists. They are pieces of you-know-what. And we put them in the same category as, young men who jump on boats to get a better life in another country. They're not the same. They are absolute garbage. They shouldn't be here. And if those blokes, the Prime Minister and the Immigration Minister, the activist, both had a commitment to doing the best thing for Australia, they would get rid of them. And there's no motivation to do that.
All right, Jason Morrison, Joe Kelly, thank you both for joining me tonight. Now, after the break, budget sneak peek predicts higher wages and tax breaks. All the details next with Warren Hogan. Welcome back. Well, on Tuesday, Jim Chalmers will deliver his second full-year budget. Now, we already know there's going to be some cost of living relief, but the Treasurer promises that the budget isn't going to have an impact on inflation. I'm joined now by Judo Bank Chief Economist Warren Hogan. Warren, do you think that's possible if the Stage 3 tax cuts are going to take effect from the 1st of July this year? Do you think that the budget will be austere enough not to impact on inflation?
I am very worried that they're actually going to be spending quite a bit of money and putting a lot of extra money into the economy on top of those very generous tax cuts which are coming on 1 July. So this is, I think, the real focus for all of us, thinking about what kind of pressure that'll put on inflation. And of course, if it's going to put upward pressure on interest rates, we now know that the RBA is very close to raising rates. I think the other thing next week is they're going to be talking about their grand plan, their vision for the next term of government, which is should be welcomed, that we know what they're thinking. But as it's shaping up, this future made in Australia, it's looking like a lot of government intervention, which will also involve a lot of government spending down the track.
Now, the figures late last year and early this year, it indicated that the inflation fight was on a better track than we know it now is. The economic forecast was looking stronger. So when the Treasurer would have been preparing the bulk of his budget, he would have had a rosier picture of the economy. Do you think that's going to have an impact?
It's going to be really interesting to see, actually, because the Treasurer was really positioning the economy as slowing, that the emphasis is not just cost of living and inflation and growth, but really what we've seen in the last month is a stronger economy than what we thought, creating jobs, higher inflation than what we thought, and of course this risk that the RBA might have to raise rates further. And really that should have been a handbrake on any new spending. But the Treasurer's been out on the front foot this week and talking a lot about the importance of supporting households and cost of living. So I actually think they're going to be doing quite a bit next week, and it's going to put the RBA in quite a difficult position. We have to wait and see. Of course, they may have some offsetting measures, but it looks like we should get set for quite a few big announcements on top of those tax breaks, such as rent assistance, such as energy rebates, which I think is just new money into the economy.
So Michelle Bullock making it very clear this week that an interest rate hike is possible, it is on the table. She said, all options are on the table depending on where inflation goes, but she's very committed to keeping it on track to reach the target band of 2 to 3%. Do you think that if there is more spending in this budget than there was in the last, this will then become a political issue and the coalition will seek to blame the government if there is an interest rate rise?
Yeah, look, this is
Warren,
such a diabolical situation.
I didn't realise the time. I'm so sorry. Thank you very much for joining me. I'll see you Monday. Here's Paul Murray.